So my name's Neil Cox and I'm the Director of the Artist Rooms Research Partnership, and this is Café des Artistes number 10. So in honour of our 10th birthday there are some cupcakes which you can freely and liberally consume as we go along. So Artist Rooms, as I'm sure many of you know, is a major collection of international, mostly contemporary art, acquired through the generosity of Anthony Doffey, the dealer and collector, and now owned and managed by Tate and National Galleries of Scotland. And the Artist Rooms Research Partnership exists to develop and deliver high quality research and interpretation around the collection in collaboration with our partners. And one of the things we do is run these cafe events. These are informal, as you can see, and please feel free to help yourself to the free wine here in the Fruit Market Gallery, and the cupcakes, as I say, as we go along. If you want to know more about us and our activities, do like our Facebook page, and you can also, as you can see there, catch up on previous cafes on our podcast site on YouTube. And that's why we're recording this one. This will also be a podcast later on. So we're delighted for this 10th cafe to be focusing on the artist Francesco Woodman, who is one of the 38 artists in the collection. And we are delighted also to have our two speakers with us to take us through this artist's work and give us some perspectives on it. And in fact, this is a first tonight because one of the speakers is John White, who is an MSc student in the University of Edinburgh History of Art, and is also an intern on the Artist Rooms Research Partnership project. And he's one of a whole army of interns. Interns, put your hands in the air. There you go. There are a lot of them. And in fact, it is they rather than me that deliver these projects. But John is actually also writing for Tate's website summary texts on the works of Francesco Woodman in the Artist Rooms collection, and has particular interests in this kind of material. He has previously interned at the Chinati Foundation in Marfa, Texas, and at ArtNet's New York offices. And he studied at Brown University, History of Art there, which is a great place, and wrote his thesis on Rauschenberg's influence in Trisha Brown's work. And he's interested in issues around feminism, site specificity and performance, all relevant to thinking about Woodman. Our second speaker is Harriet Rich, who did her PhD at UCL, and her research focuses entirely on women and photography, so she's squarely in the field for this cafe. Her thesis, in fact, focused on Francesco Woodman, and particularly on questions around self-representation and performance in the photographic medium. Harriet's published her research on this topic in journals like Oxford Art Journal and Photographies, as well as in the book Girls, Girls, Girls in Contemporary Art, which you can look up on its Intellect Books, 2011. She writes for the journal After Image and is now writing a book on femininity and historiography of photography. And Harriet is senior lecturer at Kingston, which is also a very good place. So John's going to speak first, I think, for 15-20 minutes, and Harriet will follow. And then in the spirit of our cafes, we'll then open up some space for you to have a discussion and drink more wine and eat more cupcakes. And then we'll come back together for Q&A and feedback on different perspectives on the material. And we will set you some questions if they help, but you can ignore them if you want to say something else. Okay, so without further ado, we'll hand over to John.
Okay, great. Thank you, Neil, for the introduction. As he said, I'm writing a series of summaries on Francesco Woodman photographs that are in the Artist Rooms collection. There are a total of 18 photographs by Woodman in the Artist Rooms collection, and I'm writing specifically about 10 of them. So my talk tonight is going to be focused on 6 of those 10, using them as sort of case studies for revealing ways in which art historians have approached and theorized her work since her death. And those 18 photographs of hers are actually currently on display in Wales at Oriel Davies Gallery, if anyone wants to go before the 25th of this month, which is when it ends. A lot of the photographs by Woodman that are in the Artist Rooms collection are some of her less frequently reproduced ones. And so I think that's really exciting in that they provide sort of ways to fill in gaps between the more frequently reproduced photographs that have been talked about, perhaps sometimes a little too much, in my opinion. And this is one of the more frequently reproduced photographs of hers, which is in the Artist Rooms collection, which I will not be talking about. But you can look at it. And finally, I just want to say that my talk will, of course, by no means be comprehensive. Her work has been extensively written about, and there was no way that in 20 minutes I could fit in everything that's been said. For instance, a lot of art historians have written about the influence of surrealism in her work, and I'm not going to talk about that at all. So I'm sorry if anyone who's here is a devotee of surrealism, but perhaps you can do some of your own research. So without any further ado, Francesco Woodman was born in Boulder, Colorado in the USA in 1958. Both of her artists are parents. Both of her parents are artists. George and Betty Woodman. They are ceramicists and painters, and they work in a variety of media. They're still exhibiting work today. So she was raised in a very artistic environment, to say the least. She attended the Rhode Island School of Design, which is colloquially referred to as RISD, between 1975 and 1979. Today, and I think then as well, it's considered one of the, if not the best art school in the country. So primary sources generally say that she was like a very devoted student who worked exhaustively on her work. And after RISD, she moved to New York to be an artist in earnest. After less than 2 years there and a couple other places, she committed suicide by jumping off of a Manhattan rooftop in January 1981. She was 22 at the time. Thus, most of the work she produced was student work, so to speak, which for some art historians has been an important factor. Perhaps largely due to her suicide, she has achieved posthumously a sort of mythical or cult status, which I'll be interrogating somewhat in my talk. And lastly, before we look at the first photograph I'm going to talk about, just a note on the scale of her photographs. My PowerPoint is going to be really misleading in the sense that her photographs are very, very small. Most of them are about Polaroid size. So the handouts on your table will give you a better sense about what it's like to apprehend her images. This first photo, like most of the photos I'm going to be talking about, is untitled. We see a door free from its frame, propped precariously against 2 adjacent walls. Underneath the door is Woodman, only her lower half visible. She lies directly on the floor with her knees bent, and her legs catch the light from the window that is visible above the door. Her backside is in shadow, and her right foot is blurred in movement. Cultural theorist Meek Baal, who actually just spoke here a couple weeks ago, has argued that Woodman was not interested in fixing moments in time. Rather, she was interested in, quote, unfixing the subjects of her photographs, typically herself. As Baal writes, Woodman is almost always physically present in her photographs, but never, as in this one, quite visible. Baal writes specifically about the blur in Woodman's photographs and how, for instance, with the foot here, the blur serves to obscure Woodman even as she exposes herself. Although her lower body is nude, Woodman has hidden any identifying body features from view and made the visible part of her body anonymous. A line of light leads the eye down the side of her leg to a fully illuminated foot, but a clear view of even just that one body part is prevented by her movement. To borrow Baal's words, photographs such as this one are images that are still images that won't stand still, which is a quote that I quite like. The room in this photograph, with its peeling ceiling and its sort of discolored walls, is characteristic of the abandoned spaces in which Woodman often worked. The first major exhibit of Woodman's work after her death was in 1986 at the Wellesley College Museum in Massachusetts, for which art historian Abigail Solomon Godot wrote what remains today to be perhaps one of the most influential essays on Woodman's work. Solomon Godot wrote about photographs in which Woodman obscures herself in abandoned houses, such as this one, as commentaries on the imprisoning and consuming nature of women's historical relegation by men to the realm of domestic spaces. Indeed, Woodman's nude body here is hidden and sort of violently bisected by the door. One might say that she's even dehumanized in that her shadowed and blurry lower half doesn't readily appear to the viewer as a body without the context of an upper half. However, as multiple art historians have since argued, Solomon Godot's essay limits readings of Woodman's photographs. Solomon Godot placed Woodman alongside the likes of Cindy Sherman, an artist who contemporaneously with Woodman made photos such as these, which are in the collection of the Tate, but not the Artist Room's collection. Photos such as these depicting herself in a variety of roles inspired by film characters in order to critique culturally constructed oppressive ideas about female identity. Art historian Margaret Sundell has said that though Woodman's photographs do reveal that femininity is a social construct, reading them in Solomon Godot's way restrictively deals with only certain aspects of the work, such as how it plays with seduction and the male gaze. Which leads me to the second photo, which is also untitled. Here we see Woodman crouched on her hands and knees atop a mirror on the floor. Woodman's upper body is clothed in a sweater, but her lower body appears entirely unclothed. She leans toward the mirror, her arms bent and her back lowered. However, her head, slightly blurred, turns back to look up at the camera. Below the photograph on the paper mount, Woodman has written in red ink, "See you Sunday, bow wow, love, spot." And you might be able to read that better on, this is one of the handouts that you have. Writer and art critic David Levi Strauss has argued that, like in this photograph, Woodman's role as both artist and oftentimes nude subject subverts traditional modes of photography in which women were captured, so to speak, and looked at exclusively by men. Mirrors like this one are frequent props in Woodman's photos, and curator Harm Lux has written that the mirrors in Woodman's work do not serve a narcissistic purpose. Indeed, Woodman turns away from the mirror here, but rather mock voyeuristic viewers by rarely reflecting Woodman very fully or clearly. This photograph is interesting to me because it had an intended audience. She gave this photograph to Benjamin Moore, an MFA student in glasswork at RISD, who was her boyfriend at the time. The playful correspondence therefore suggests that Spot was a pet name for Woodman that she here adopts and performs as a kind of persona in a sexual fantasy. Because it was originally intended for Moore, the photograph disrupts readings of it that might suggest Woodman is denying sexualization by the male gaze. In fact, the mirror's reflection here affords the viewer a glimpse of Woodman's front side, in particular the sharp V-neck of her cardigan. The work therefore seems to instead support arguments like one by art historian Lorraine Kenny that say Woodman in her photographs strategically complies with the pornographic gaze rather than frustrates it. Of course, this all goes back to what Margaret Sundell said about being frustrated that Woodman's work contains much more than commentaries on female identity and objectification. So I'd like to read a quote from something Woodman's friend Betsy Byrne has written, because I think it deals with what Byrne calls the feminist question better than just about anything else I've read on Woodman. Byrne writes, "The truth is, it was a moot point or a moot question. We were at the very beginning of a generation who were feminists as a matter of course. We were ungrateful wretches who took it for granted. If anything, Francesca felt guilty that she wasn't a, quote, real feminist, even though of course she was, simply because she was a woman who took herself and her work seriously. There was no need to discuss it or to parade feminist theory in obvious self-conscious visuals. Francesca was simply doing her work, and hopefully it would provoke and tease, raise questions and suggest answers, and reflect ambivalence about being a woman and much more than that." Beyond the feminist question, this photo is also interesting to me in that it makes me think of something else Byrne says, that people often miss the humor in Woodman's photos. I love the dimension that this message adds to the photo and the sort of glimpse that it gives us into her personality. And there's another photo by Woodman in the Artist Rooms collection that has, like this, a message to Benjamin Moore written below it. And we're going to briefly look at it later. This is another untitled photograph. Woodman is seated along the photograph's right edge, facing the camera. She's wearing dark, heavy-looking clothing, and her hands sit in her lap where they stand out amongst all the black. They are further illuminated by a slant of light that directs the eye to the left, where an array of framed old photographs of mostly children appear on a table. Art historian Peggy Phelan suggested that Woodman's photos were rehearsals for her ultimate suicide, that she, quote, traces her own disappearance. Phelan criticized preceding scholarly work on Woodman, like Solomon Gatto's essay, for shying away from even using the word suicide. In this photograph, Woodman can certainly be said to disappear herself. She is literally effaced by the darkness, her facial features or lack thereof blending continuously into the black of the clothing, which notably is reminiscent of mourning dress, and that's mourning with a U. That her hands are lit might, amongst other things, be taken to signify her role as photographer, the artist's hand made visible, so to speak. However, her hands are rather still and cold-looking, and they're not blurred. The group of photographs that is also highlighted might suggest the ability of images to preserve a person's state in time, indeed, to outlive their depicted subject, as this image itself has done. However, other art historians have rejected reading Woodman's suicide retroactively into her work in this manner, which raises larger questions about biography's role in art historian and art viewers' understanding of works of art in general, which is probably something that'll come up more in both my and Dr. Rich's talks. Also of note to me is that Woodman here has an air of someone somewhat older than she was at the time. The light lends much of her visible hair a graying quality, and her clothing is quite matronly. This makes me think of another thing her friend Betsy Byrne wrote. Byrne says, "The contorted, blurred figures in Woodman's pictures capture a bleak wisdom beyond their years, like that of a weary old woman who has seen too much, and simultaneously the sweet naivete of a pre-adolescent." If perhaps here we have a weary old woman, then here we have the sweet naivete of a pre-adolescent. In this also untitled photograph, Woodman stands with her back against a wall. She wears a patterned dress and is barefoot, and her arms, which hang down in front of her, are blurred in action. From her right hand hangs something flimsy that the blur and light make difficult to see. In contrast to Solomon Gatto's analysis of Woodman's photos in domestic spaces, Margaret Sundell has written that Woodman, quote, stages an elaborate game of hide and seek with the peeling walls and chipped floors of abandoned dwellings. Woodman here plays a game of hide and seek with the viewer by blurring her arms and the flimsy material in her hand, as well as by hiding her face. Sundell points to Woodman's frequently childish attire to argue that these photographs of Woodman's convey, quote, a sense of playing house, of the way a child feels at once overwhelmed and omnipotently invisible when infiltrating a place that adults once owned. Here, Woodman's interest in vintage clothing does appear, if not exactly childish, then perhaps of a child playing dress-up and trying to seem adult. Her bare feet are out of place with her frilly garments, as are her active arms that seem to tear at the wallpaper or scoop down to play with the dead, or scoop up and play with some of the dead leaves. Dr. Riches, has also written quite a bit about girlishness and especially Woodman's house photographs, and I think perspectives like these are really refreshing amidst all of the mythologizing that's been done of Woodman since her death. Something else this photo brings to mind for me is art historian Benjamin Buclow's assertion that Woodman was fascinated by the materiality and process of photography. He writes that Woodman's photographs reveal ways in which she anticipated the flattening of subject matter that is inevitable in photography's creation of a two-dimensional product. Images like this one, in which Woodman seems to blend in with the wallpaper, exemplify this. You can see that her dress ends right at the edge of the baseboard, or I've been told that what's known to me as a baseboard is here referred to as a skirting board, which makes at least the clothed area of her body seem continuous with the flat wall. This photograph, I think, is also interesting to put in conversation with Buclow's ideas. Woodman, naked and looking at the camera, is seated on a cushioned wooden stool. To her right stands a naked woman whose head is out of frame. The left third of the image is dominated by shelves that contain books, papers, and bottles of different sizes, as well as below the shelves an array of papers and various objects that sit on the floor. With what Buchloh has said in mind, on the one hand, Woodman and the other woman are treated with no more significance than are the objects seen around them. Their bodies are off-center, and in the case of the woman on the left, indiscriminately cropped. Dr. Riches has also written about the violence of cropping in Woodman's images, and I think the quite violent cropping of the standing woman here is fascinating. It makes her more identifiable by her breasts than by any other feature. And in this sense, the seemingly objectified woman might speak to a way in which Woodman was working within an expectation of, in the words of Buchloh, photography's translation of the body from volume to flatness, from somatic presence to photographic representation. On the other hand, though, the mirror behind the standing woman prevents her body from really being flattened by creating a sense of depth and by rounding out a more full view of her legs. Indeed, the mirror permits more than one side of the woman, so to speak, to be present in the resulting photograph. Lastly, I want to talk about this image, which is actually one of the most commonly reproduced Woodman photographs, in which case we're quite lucky to have it in the Artist Rooms collection. It's part of what's called the Eel series, the other parts of which are not in the Artist Rooms collection. And it was produced during the time in 1977 and 78 that Woodman spent studying abroad in Rome on RISD's honors program. Just below center of this photograph is a bowl containing the slimy, twisted body of an eel. Woodman lies naked directly on the floor, her legs slightly bent so that the line of her body from knees to upper body follows the curve of the bowl. Her left arm is extended and bent so that this line continues almost 3/4 of the way around the bowl before terminating with her upturned hand. Harm Lux has written about the eel series through the lens of psychoanalysis, taking as a starting point the eel as a phallic symbol. But I'm not so interested in his reading. Rather, I'm interested in a bit more of a formal analysis. With her face obscured underneath her arm, only Woodman's hair, and not very much of it, is visible above her angular shoulder. Her body is positioned so that formally its sex is not obvious. Her secondary sex characteristics, her breasts and her groin area, are not visible, so that her body thus appears akin to that of the eel. This obscuring of her sex is more or less present in actually quite a few of Woodman's photographs. To return to the one that we started with, how do we know that that is Francesco Woodman? Of course, all signs point to the fact that it probably was Woodman, but to me, these photos tell us that not only is it potentially a mistake to assume that the body is Woodman's, but it might also be a mistake to assume that the body is a woman's. Just as reading Woodman's biography into her work too much may lead us to miss the many other elements at play in her images, reading the body automatically as female may lead us to bring to the image myriad reductive ideas or ideals about femininity that only distance us from a nuanced understanding of such images. If you'll forgive me for using Betsy Burns' words so much, I'll read one last quote by her that I think is really thought-provoking. Byrne asks, is the work really narcissistic? Is it really about self-portraiture? Yes, Francesca had a streak of narcissism, along with a mean streak of vanity, I might add. How many artists or writers don't have, at the very least, a streak? But once again, it was a source of conflict. Francesca was ashamed that she took so many pictures of herself, and was irritated by the simplistic self-portrait label attached to her work. She tried using models over and over. Sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. But the reality was she was her own best model because she alone knew what she was after. And as she was the first to say, she was the only one who was always available. So with that in mind, I'm going to flip briefly through the other 4 pictures that I'm writing about, but that I'm not going to talk about here, as I end with 3 questions. Are the images I've shown self-portraits? Some of them may be self-portraits to you, some of them may not be. Maybe to you, none of them are. But I'm less interested in a yes or no answer, and I'm more interested in sort of interrogating what self-portraiture is or means. Second, How much should biography inform analysis of Woodman's photographs and of art in general? What are the benefits, limitations, etc., of a biographical approach to art history? That's the other photograph. Oh, no, it's not, sorry. That photograph does show Benjamin Moore, her boyfriend at the time, but this is the one with a message that I was also mentioning earlier. And finally, why do you think Woodman's work continues to outlast her so powerfully? That's...
So I think it's really interesting to see some of the images that John showed, images that aren't so often reproduced, and images that I'm not so familiar with. And I'm going to talk about some other images that those of you that might be familiar with Francesco Woodman's work might not have seen. And some of the photographs that I'm talking about are ones that I hadn't seen way back in the midst of time when I did my PhD on her work. So it's kind of work that I looked at afterwards. And I'm going to jump forward a little bit in time from the period that John's been talking about to only a couple of years after Woodman graduated from RISD, just a few months before her death, to look at the work that she produced in those kind of last months of her life. A period which, as John described, as a period in which she was trying to be an artist in earnest in New York City when she moved there after graduation. So I'm jumping forward to the spring and summer of 1980, a time when some of her photographs were being shown at the same time in two very different group exhibitions which were running concurrently in New York. In one show, Pictorialism, at the Daniel Wolfe Gallery, some of her college output was included with the work of contemporaries, slightly older photographers, but photographers that went on to become household names, such as Sheila Metzner and Sally Mann, who most of you will have heard of. And these were shown alongside examples of pictorialist photography from the 19th century. And in part, that show was designed to rehabilitate a genre of photography that at that point in time, the turn of the 1980s, was considered to be very outmoded and very kind of sentimentalized. A genre that one contemporary reviewer described as a dirty word within the language of fine art at that moment. At the same time, the show attempted to make clear a line of descent from the 19th century to the present day by demonstrating what was identified as a recurrent impulse in the history of photography that celebrated artistic expression over and above a more modernist emphasis on the medium's capacity for realism or documentary truth. Across town, a very different photographic language was being explored in another show at the same time, in the more experimental spaces of the Alternative Museum, that no longer exists, it exists online, where the emphasis was not on reforging links to photography's past, but instead on looking to its future. This show, which was called Beyond Photography 1980, was very different in scope, and it included only contemporary photography, and examples of very diverse practices that all in some way looked beyond the boundaries of the medium. For example, it included prints that were made by sprinkling carbon dust onto photosensitive, clay-coated papers, photo collage, work that was kind of made up from Xerox copies, as well as manipulated Polaroids. So quite a different approach to photography at that time. Again, the emphasis wasn't on the kind of straight, unmanipulated photograph as document, but in this show, it was more of a hybrid object, exploring the vocabulary of the medium, as one critic suggested at the time, quote, beyond the normal interpretation of the world. Word, not world. And it was in this alternative gallery that Woodman exhibited some of the blueprints that she had begun to produce right at the end of the 1970s after graduation. In particular, a large-scale blueprint, or more accurately, a diazotype collage that remained unfinished at her death, but which is now preserved as if a kind of complete project in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which I'm showing here. and embarrassingly show a picture of myself in front of it, but I just wanted to give a sense of the scale when I was lucky enough to see it when it was on show in 2012. I don't think it's on show anymore, but you get a sense of the scale. I'll go back to the better picture. We can only wonder why she abandoned her earlier practice of unmanipulated silver photography and the production of the barely, if at all, enlarged, exquisitely detailed prints that John has shown, and some of which you've got on your tables kind of reproduced there as the size that she printed them up. We don't have an awful lot to go on, and no doubt as a young artist trying to establish an independent practice in the art world, she was attracted by what was a relatively simple and cheap process that used readily available commercially produced materials. But the size of these prints or collages, some of which measure over 2 metre tall and some of them are 3 or 4 metre wide, combined with a very mechanised process and kind of industrially based kind of materials, might also reveal a changing relationship to photography as a medium. Suggestive of Woodman's unshakable fascination with the materiality, conditions and potential limits of the photograph as both image and object, these later blueprint works seem to dramatise her conceptual engagement with the medium itself. And it's that concern that, to me anyway, seemed to be at the heart of her practice throughout what was a very short career. I think it was this sense of fascination that first interested me in her work. And I can still quite vividly remember seeing her photography for the first time, which was in the first UK exhibition of her work at the Photographers Gallery in London back in 1999. And it was that exhibition that prompted me to focus on it in my PhD study. But 2 photographs in particular stick in my memory, and I apologise, John, but these are photographs that are often reproduced and talked about an awful lot. But these were the ones I think that really interested me because of the way that they related that idea of self-representation to photography itself. In a project that appears to be focused on the self, as many people have noted, it's Woodman's insistence on disappearing from the frame that I found compelling, but particularly the way in which she seems to act it out through the process or associations of photography. So in this very well-known image on the left, she hides both her own face and the faces of her models with prints of her own face. The specifically photographic nature of that disappearance or that hiding is really clear because the light bounces off the glossy surface of each print's very crumpled material surface. You can see the materiality of those images, and it almost obscures the detail of the 4th self-portrait that's pinned to the wall there. As so often with her work, there's a gap between her real face, whatever that might mean, and the photographic mask that she wears so explicitly in this image that seems to suggest an unbridgeable distance between self and photographic self-image, an image that is obviously only ever the kind of ephemeral tracing of light as it bounces off the surfaces of the world. And here on the right, we see Woodman again, or we think we do. Again, her identity is only kind of hinted at. And if you look at a lot of her work, it's hinted at by her trademark Mary Jane slippers that we see her often wearing. Again, her face is cropped by the framing edge of the photograph, but her presence, or her absence, is imprinted on the floor, where we see the silhouette of her body where it touched photosensitive powder that she sprinkled over the floorboards. So she is a negative trace. She is her own shadow in this work, an indexical mark that can only be seen once the original object or referent has disappeared or sat down in the corner. It seems to me that Woodman's repetitive conjuring of the self is one that is always articulated within the vocabulary of the medium. As John has already suggested, there is no attempt to reveal anything of her identity or her selfhood or subjectivity. Francesco Woodman, as a person, is not present in these images, but she uses her body and image to act out the process of a living subject undergoing a photographic process of objectification, which recalls what John was saying about Benjamin Bucklow's kind of the idea of being flattened to fit that field of representation. So, this is where my own search for Francesco Woodman started, I think, but it continued. It took me to New York, a long time ago, to meet her parents, who have become quite a kind of important factor in the way that her work's understood and the way that her legacy is kind of kept alive. We might talk about that later. But also to view the archive of her work that at that moment, around 2000, had been digitised. So it was quite strange to put this mythical but apparently quite eccentric character into a real-world context. And in fact, the reality of the experience didn't disappoint. And I can remember trying to get hold of her father, George, on one of those New York public payphones. I was a young student, I didn't have any money, and so I was trying to use those payphones and I could never get them to work. I was putting the wrong money and the wrong code into them. And I just couldn't get hold of him. So I finally went into one of the payphones in the New York Public Library, and it was in one of those like little confessional booths, and they're all quiet. And finally, after the millionth time of trying, got through to the apartment. But Betty answered the phone. We had a little chat, and they're quite old. But George wasn't there for our kind of prearranged chat because he'd gone out to buy shoes, which when I met him kind of made sense. But anyway, finally got hold of him, and we arranged to go and meet in their kind of beautiful apartment in the Chelsea brownstone. I went up in one of those kind of old-fashioned New York lifts, and I just thought this was the height of glamour. I just thought it was fantastic. And then I had this amazing experience of going through some of her original vintage prints on the dining room table with George, and where he talked me through her work and her life from his very specific perspective. Whilst Betty was in the background making cups of tea, and this in this kind of incredibly beautiful space that was full of George's paintings and Betty's even more beautiful ceramics and glassware. So it was a kind of an amazing experience. And then after that, I spent the next few days of my study trip in the International Centre for Photography, where I went through every single one of her photographs that had been digitised on a series of discs, which was a very different experience, obviously, to seeing them in the flesh on the dining room table. But it was kind of an interesting experience because there's about 800 or so photographs that she took. And not many of them are repeated. She often tore up her negatives or kind of just made one unique print from her work. So I was seeing these images en masse. And what was interesting is that at first it kind of appears as this kind of endless project of self-representation. But as John has already noted, it's an endless project of disappearance where she seems to kind of consistently kind of play hide and seek. But it's a very specifically photographic hide and seek that I think she's playing. One of the things that I found here, and I have to apologise for these images, because I suddenly remembered I hadn't got high-resolution files of them, because when I published about this book, the estate wouldn't let me reproduce them. So I had to scan these very, very quickly yesterday from another catalogue, and they've since been published, so I'm sorry, they're not very good quality. This is one of her artist books that she made, which is called Portrait of a Reputation. At that time, I hadn't seen before. It hadn't been published, it hadn't been exhibited, although it has been subsequently. It's undated, but it was made while she was at RISD, so between 76 and 78. And it's a little book of just 5 photographs that, as we might imagine, show herself. But I think it's a good example of the way in which she used her self-image to kind of narrate this process of photographic disappearance. So you might imagine in this book that process being acted out, and we see in this first shot this kind of stiff, formal pose, as if she's kind of posing for her camera. And there's a sense in which there's this kind of double registration of the image, which isn't kind of something that she did a lot. But it almost seems to suggest the kind of snap of the shutter when that image is taken. And as the series progresses, you see this imprint or outline or silhouette of her hand on her chest that almost appears like a retinal after image, like the kind of what you see in your eye after a flash. And then that kind of position of her hands is traced on her body, and in the final image, she disappears to leave those handprints on the wall. And I thought this was interesting. If you imagine it's tied by a red ribbon, it's a short book, it's in a codex format, and you can almost imagine animating it like a flick book, which, if you can imagine it kind of narrating this process where she appears and poses, and then she's gone. So if there's any single unbroken thread that weaves throughout her practice, if there is, there might not be, I think it's this interrogation of the subject's disappearance in photographic terms. A formalist interest in photography was first identified by Rosalind Krauss in her essay Problem Sets, and then was kind of raised again in the roundtable discussion that was published in the pages of Art Journal in 2003, which included, amongst others, Margaret Sundell, who'd written on her work earlier, and George Baker, where there was a kind of reappraisal of what her work would mean in kind of in the 21st century. And here, to counter some of the biographical interpretations that have at times dominated the historiography of her work, as John has suggested, in this round table, they suggested that her enduring appeal is due to her identity in part as a photographer's photographer, which I think is quite an interesting concept and something hopefully we can go back to talk about. An interpretation that in some ways counters the earlier labelling of her as a rare photographic prodigy, who, as Abigail Solomon Godot suggested, is hard to place, this idea of a prodigy that's come out of nowhere, completely decontextualised, but also kind of fixes her work in another way, within a different set of prescriptive but purely formal concerns. So it was a kind of interesting look back on what had been written about her work before and opened up other ways of seeing her. And what I think is that while she was obsessed with the medium, it wasn't in terms of shoring up its boundaries or defining its specificity, as we might imagine in a kind of modernist project, but pushing at its limits. And there are a number of ways in which that interest is revealed. And John picked this up in relation to Mika Bull's comments, which I must say I haven't read for a long time and had slipped my mind. But she frequently introduced time into her images, as well as the sense of animation and movement that we might imagine when kind of looking at a book like this. She also used repeated elements, repeated motifs within single images that create a sense of kind of disjunction or a sense of rhythm, as well as ordering her work into series and sequences, which she often then went back and reordered and kind of shuffled around. Introducing a sense of duration that defies the limits of the single still shot and expands photography into 3 and 4 dimensions. She experimented with moving image proper whilst undertaking an innovative video-making program at RISD, and she produced some very, very short films that were collected and restored as selected video works from 1975 to 1978, and they were shown at Tate Modern alongside the Artist Room photographs a few years ago. And if you see these fragments, you begin to understand the performative context of some of her prints. So examples such as this, as one that John said he wasn't going to talk about. In one of the videos, you see the performance or the creation of these body prints. You see her kind of getting up and pressing her body on the ground and then getting up and walking away. And in another one, and I've got a still from it here, you see Woodman kind of her body behind this translucent sheet of tracing paper on which is written her name, and she slowly tears at the paper, destroying kind of an inscription of her identity, revealing her body, and at the end she steps through this kind of torn sheet and walks through it, walks away to the camera. And I have got there's a little clip here which I'm not sure if it's going to come up actually, but maybe we could come back to later, which is a terrible quality YouTube clip that shows the video. Someone's videoed it, but maybe we could come back to it. But that performative element wasn't confined to the relationship between herself and her camera, but extended to incorporate the viewer as well. Her undergraduate degree show project from 1978 that represents the culmination of her work at RISD is a good example of this. Swan Song, which was a series of 5 very large-scale prints, and each of them are kind of a metre square. She again refuses to show her face. And throughout this series, the camera's been upended, so she's looking down on her body, which her body kind of shifts around this kind of ream of paper that's placed on a table as she kind of moves around it, again, evading its gaze. But here the camera's more like a kind of microscope looking down on the body rather than a camera, which you expect that kind of more horizontal relationship. So it's almost as if her body or herself is a kind of specimen to be scrutinised, to be looked at. And there's an image here of these photographs installed at Victoria Miro in 2007, just after they were restored, because they had only just been, well, they knew they were there in this state, but they were all rolled up and they were very, very fragile, and they restored them and digitised them, and then they were shown here. But you can get a bit of a sense of how big they are and how different that is to the images that you've got in front of you. But what's also interesting is that these on show here were very different to the way that they were originally installed at her graduate show. At RISD, the edges of the paper were torn in a way that kind of resists the photograph's rectilinear format, so they have kind of ragged edges, which you can see on the digitised copies if you look closely. They were unframed, they were tacked to the wall, so as to kind of transgress that boundary between the flat fine art photograph and the surface of the gallery wall. And again, this isn't a very good image. I had to do them very small because they were just getting worse and worse as I blew them up. But it does give you a sense of how they were installed in the gallery at RISD. Some of them were right down on the skirting board, and then some of them were up high. It was a very kind of sculptural installation of the work. So as well as them being huge in scale, they were also installed in this space and around this space in a way that kind of demanded a very different kind of encounter with them. After graduation, her interest in this sculptural potential was explored further, and she began to experiment with cyanotype and blueprint processes after moving to New York. These are some examples that she produced while she was artist in residence at the MacDowell Colony in Peterborough, New Hampshire, in 1980, where she kind of applied her experimentation with this diazotype process to create these vast prints that you see here. She called them blueprints, and they're kind of vaguely based on an old-fashioned blueprint cyanotype process, but they are more accurately created through diazotype printing, which is kind of an industrialized form of blueprinting from the mid-20th century, developed in the 1950s as a commercialized form of printing to reproduce architects' drawing and architects' plans, because they produce positive prints rather than negative prints, which is what traditional blueprints do. And they're made by using pre-prepared papers that go through this funny machine and exposes them to gas, and they come out with these positive copies that can be tinted blue or can be tinted sepia. So they're quite, there's quite a lot of kind of room for experimentation with the tone of them. Anyway, to make images such as this tree piece, she projected existing transparencies of her own photographs she'd already made, onto these large sheets of commercially produced paper, which were hung out in a darkened room with a projector for kind of hours and hours and hours, up to 8 hours. So the original's enlargement on such a scale resulted in very hazy, out-of-focus prints that aren't kind of perfectly registered. You can see the kind of throughout these works where the projector might have accidentally moved or deliberately been moved. And for this series, she then exhibited them outside, hung up on a kind of washing line, juxtaposing. These are details of the kind of turned legs, furniture legs, against the trees from which they were kind of hewn. But obviously, it wasn't long before she kind of turned that process on herself. And again, this is really hard to reproduce and show in a PowerPoint format. But she used her own body as the kind of subject for these works. And this is part of a series called Zigzag, or a study for Zigzag. It's very hard to know what's the final piece for these works. They're all kind of studies in some way. But here, this kind of very exaggerated horizontal format is emphasised. And the field is divided up into these individual cells that give it quite an obvious film-like appearance. Or some have noted in relation to this example, and this is from the show just before Christmas at Victoria Miro in Mayfair. In these kind of dual images, they're almost like the slides of a stereoscope, you know, those kind of two images from the 19th century. So they have quite a cinematic effect. They appear like the frames on a film. At the same time, the vast scale of the resulting prints invites a kind of immersive cinematic experience. But you're not sat here looking at a screen. Your body is mobilized. Viewing these demands a kind of physical interaction that, again, is very different from that intimate close-up viewing that her earlier tiny little prints would have demanded. Abigail Solomon Goddeau described these late blueprints as extraordinary and monumental, their heroic scale and tenebrous effect having in effect created a new photographic form. Yet while recognising what she describes as the recurrence of excess, displacement and disordering effects in her earlier work, she doesn't connect these late works, foregrounding of these very effects, as symptomatic of Woodman's engagement with postmodernist photography of the 1980s, photography to which she concludes Woodman's bears no, quote, obvious resemblance. And I just want to finish by thinking about that resemblance, because it's by thinking about these strategies of excess, displacement and disordering that we can make a kind of conceptual link to that work from which it's been kind of disconnected or displaced. John's already mentioned or shown some Cindy Sherman work, which is a kind of obvious connection to make. They were kind of exact contemporaries, and these works, these series, Bus Riders and Murder Mystery People, which were made in 1976, represent a similar kind of body of just graduated work, postgraduate work, produced around the same time that Woodman was graduating from RISD. There are obvious similarities in their work. They both worked in series. They both photographed themselves, if only to disrupt that promise of self-portrayal, often masking their identity as a way of questioning the idea of any essential self in a way that reflected the period's problematization of conventional notions of stable identity. And this is what I want to finish on, is just thinking about how they both kind of stage or probe that gap between reality and its photographic representation. In this series, for example, there's no attempt at realism. If you look closely at this work, it's hard to see here, Sherman uses props and costume to act out these characters, but there's always a very clear discrepancy between self and the image that she's representing, particularly in her use of makeup, where it's worn very much like a mask. There's no attempt at kind of realism in these images. And in these images, as with Woodman's, she maintains this kind of connection between the characters that she's performing and the kind of the position of the artist behind the camera. And that's figured by the cable release, which you see kind of snaking towards the camera. You can see a ball of her foot in the image on the right there. Oh, I know I'm running out of time now. I just want to kind of go back to some of these works to kind of think about that connection. So in this study, which again is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, it's one of the images that I've reproduced, we see that symbol and tool of self-representation in her hand here. But as with so many of Woodman's work, she's again decapitated by the photograph's framing edge. We don't see her face. Again, you have to kind of imagine the scale of this image. This is one of the ones, I haven't put the size on, but it's about 2 meters tall. And again, projected over many hours in this darkened room, you can see the pronounced grain of that highly enlarged image on the surface of the diazotype that seems to inscribe that duration on the surface as a duration in which Woodman doesn't kind of come into the image but seems to disappear. And that elusive presence that's kind of promised in some of those kind of earlier studies, in the final work, the Temple Project, kind of breaks down completely. In this fragmented, fractured, collaged work, it never adds up to a complete whole. We never see Francesco Woodman at all in an image like this. And instead, the internal fractures of the collaged fragments, the individual prints that make it up, in the repeated motifs and the kind of repetitive rhythmic lines betray a piecemeal makeup and disordered logic that disconnects it from the real. Woodman disappears from the frame as the photographic subject whose presence is always impossible to pin down and always endlessly deferred. And I will end there.
Well, thank you for those fantastic talks. We now have a bit of time, 25 minutes or so, to get a drink and to talk about some of these issues that have been raised. And I think, there are the exam questions on your table. As I say, you can ignore those if you like. You can challenge them. But we're really interested in, following through on this and having an open discussion about these issues that have been raised for us in these fantastic talks. So, we'll come back together again in a little while, and we'll still be here. So, feel free to circulate and discuss further. Okay, thanks very much.
So is there anybody that wants to throw a question? Yeah.
Thank you for your talks. I'm really familiar with everything John was talking about because we've worked together on these texts that he's been writing. So thank you, Harriet, because that was all new stuff to me. I was really interested. And I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things that I was intrigued by. The little book, which was you sort of described as a flip book, and then also that zigzag work. I was wondering whether Woodman looked at chronophotography at all, Muybridge and Marais, and whether she'd been influenced by that kind of thing.
I don't. It's one of those things that I don't know. I know she was interested. I mean, again, me and John were just talking about how there's a lot of perspectives on her work, and she never looked at that. She did like all of that, which obviously you have to kind of take with a pinch of salt. But I know she was very interested in futurist photography, but I'm not sure if she'd ever looked kind of, and obviously that was impacted by chronophotography and Muybridge. But I've never seen any evidence or reference to the fact that she'd kind of, and that kind of Muybridge work wasn't. I'm trying to think, would it have been that well known when she was working? Like, I know that I was talking to just because I was talking to some students about this the other day. But there was that Hollis Frampton essay about Muybridge, wasn't there? When was that? 71. But that was So before she was working, which was that kind of time when, and that was published in Art Forum, where Muybridge's work was suddenly kind of being looked at within a kind of fine art context. So maybe she would have seen that, but I'd actually never thought about that link until I just said it just then. But yeah, she was definitely interested in futurist photography, probably more than she was interested in surrealist photography.
I haven't got anything else to add. I'm just interested in artists who look at chronophotography in some way, and there's lots of artists in the 50s and 60s who were interested in it because of Muybridge's Animal Locomotion being republished. So I just wondered whether she had, had a
was
copy
that when it
or
was
anything.
Republished in the
50s, in the mid-50s, in the States. So I was interested to know whether she did or whether that was just kind of incidental in her work. But it's interesting to know she was interested in futurism. So maybe there's a kind of indirect link there.
Yeah, but there might have been a direct one. I don't actually know.
Yeah.
I had a few different questions. One was regarding her, when she became more famous. Was that before or after she died? Did her work, come into the public eye? That was the first question. The second question was, do you think that her early death does something to our viewing of it, especially a lot of the way that you were talking about her disappearing from the work, and how often, in some of the more familiar images where she's like a ghost in a lot of there's a lot of movement, and they're very blurry, and if our feelings towards that work is very different because she died so young. And sorry, it's another question, which is what, for both of you, what was it about her work that interests you as scholars, and that you wanted to pursue that line of inquiry?
The first question, I mean, she was included in these little exhibitions before she died, but she wasn't well known at all. It was only this exhibition that John mentioned in 1986, which was at a very kind of small college museum, but it had an exhibition catalogue that had 2 essays by 2 very well-known art historians. And actually I wrote this down because I always think it's kind of interesting quote from Dave Beach, the art critic, who said that it was kind of questioned whether Woodman, I wrote it down so I remember the quote, was kind of this amazing photographer, or was she a figure on which fate or fashion or Rosalind Krauss smiled, like this sense that without that kind of incredibly influential kind of critical reflection on her work, you know, that's what kind of, you know, in relation to quite a small exhibition, made her work well known. I mean, but before that, no, her work wasn't known at all. Mm-hmm. The second question, I think, is a question that everyone else should answer. But for me, and this is what interests me, me and John were just talking about, because I teach photography students now, and I was saying about sort of 7 or 8 years ago, I was teaching at LCC in London, the photography, and I was students, I was supervising their dissertations, and there was one year when so many of the female photography students were producing work that looked like this. There was a moment in which everyone was wanted to do this, and we were just saying, what is it about it that's has made it so popular, or something that, you know, and I said, well, I can imagine, or I can vaguely remember being a 19-year-old art student, and that's the kind of thing that would have really appealed to me, I think. But for me, when I came to it, you know, a bit older than that, as an art historian, for me, it was a combination of that kind of self-representation, but it was that concentration or focus on the medium itself that I found really interesting. But I think different people find different things of interest.
Yeah. I think that leads a little bit into your second question. I agree with what Harriet said. It would be really interesting to hear people's answers to the second question, but I'll provide my own as well. I think that, well, I would be the first to say that her early suicide does for sure influence the way I read her photographs. It's kind of unavoidable, I think. The art historian Margaret Sundell wrote about how Woodman, perhaps largely helped by the 1986 exhibition, was quickly added into this sort of canon of like, what's the exact quote? The canon of like depressed...
The troubled women artists.
Troubled women artists, yeah. And it makes me think of what's called the Sylvia Plath effect, and sort of this appeal of depressive, perhaps because they're depressive, relatable, vulnerable, especially female.
But it's also
artists.
even just that early death thing, so Eva Hess has it as well, that kind of almost tragic, you know, unfulfilled kind of talent as well, isn't it?
Right. Yeah, and so what interested me in Woodman's work, I was about 19 when I first discovered it, so I think it had somewhat to do with just that relatability that Harriet was talking about. But also, before seeing Francesco Woodman's photography, I think that I had never really seen photography that, this goes back to the part of the Mika Bell quote I wrote, I had never really seen photography that seemed to me to be more than like a snapshot. And so the whole part of the Mika Bell quote, I didn't say this part, is she argues that Woodman's quotes are not snapshots because they're interested in unfixing things rather than fixing things. And so I think what was and what continues to be so interesting about her photographs to me is that they're performative, they're I'm not going to say better or anything like that, but they're different from the sort of snapshot photography that captures a moment, whereas her photography really, as we both said, captures moments and movement and performative things.
Yeah, I just had some thoughts, observations really. I was an undergraduate, I suppose, in the late 80s. I studied fine art and art history, and this what we were looking at in terms of photography and American photography were people like Steichen and I guess American photographers who were looking at abstraction in a way, or and it felt very much like the whole history of photography was still not quite allowed in history of art. And I mean, it's a funny time just sort of thinking about that and thinking about Woodman in the late 70s, and Cindy Sherman and others from that generation. What they were doing was really radical in lots of ways, and yet thinking about what they were looking at as students, what they were responding to. And I was going to say something else, but just thinking about how photography was still not taken seriously, even 10 years after this work. And thinking about this work as, if Woodman were alive today, would she balk at this stuff and say, "Oh my God, that's from," just questions I have. Yeah. And I think how her parents
stuff I did at art school. Like, God, I'd hate it if people 20 years, however many years later, were sitting talking about it. Anyway, mine wasn't as good as that, I must say.
But also thinking about how, I think there's an earlier question about this, how have her parents shaped the marketing?
That's the question that me and John were just talking about, because it's really interesting. And we were just saying that her work is, if you've studied it or if you read anything about it, a lot of it's seen through the lens of her father or her friend or a peer at RISD, and lots of these essays are written however many years later, remembering somehow this now mythical figure, and because of the way that her work was quite interesting. Those kind of very influential essays written in '86, and one of the criticisms of particularly Solomon Godot's essay is that it's looking at her work through the lens of the mid to late '80s rather than the moment it was produced. And it was along with that idea that she was this kind of prodigy that came out of nowhere, it completely decontextualizes her from what she was interested in, which was futurist photography. She was absolutely obsessed with the fashion photography of Deborah Turberville, who's that kind of amazing late 70s kind of amazing photographer whose work, when you can see some of her colour work that she made just before she died, when she was kind of desperately trying to become Deborah Turberville's assistant, it's quite interesting. And I was actually going to include one, but I don't really have time, but some of those colour shots where you see her in her ordinary clothes, and they suddenly, from these kind of timeless images in black and white, they're taken right back to 1979. It looks something out of the pages of Vogue or something. So, and it's a real kind of contrast to these kind of images that could have been taken any time, any place. I think that's quite interesting. Also, some of the people that taught her, some of the other kind of staff members at RISD, you can see the impact of her work. And I've completely forgotten her name, Wendy McNeil Snyder, who's quite a well-known photographer, I think from name. You can see there are other influences on her work.
Harry Callahan.
Did he teach her? Aaron Siskin, didn't he? But they're sort of kind of ignored in relation to the way her work's talked about, I think.
I'm just going to say that there's a documentary called The Woodmans, I think.
We were just talking about that because I haven't seen it.
It's probably just mostly her parents, I think. It's focused on them, I think.
Yeah.
I haven't seen it either, but I'd like to. Have you seen it?
I saw it. One thing that's really interesting about it is exactly what Harriet was saying, that because it's so focused on her parents, you really see the almost kind of aggressive way in which they say to the camera, like, no, she was this way, or like, no, she wasn't that way. And so the movie, or the documentary to me felt, like we've been saying, just sort of, like it didn't bring me any closer to her, just like it brought me closer to like some people who were close to her's idea about how she was. And of course, college is when, for the first time, not to generalize, but for the first time, your parents know you the least. And so it's a very interesting documentary. I do recommend it, but that's very much the slant or angle of it.
We were also saying how, you know, her estate, which is her parents essentially, and I was saying that I met them 10 years ago, and they must be in their late 80s, 90s now, and what will happen when they die, and that maybe some of her work and her writings and her kind of diaries might be then opened up for people to look at, because it's very controlled, and they're quite controlling about giving permission to reproduce images in academic writing and also, you know, whilst very happily making new editions of her work and selling them for vast amounts of money. I think there will be an interesting moment in however many years' time when it becomes kind of opened up, and there will be another reconsideration or kind of rethinking of who she is in relation, because she was clearly a prolific writer, and but I don't think they've allowed access to anyone, not even lowly people like me, but I don't think even Rosalind Krauss has read these diaries. So. And I don't know if it's, and we were, again, there was one art historian, I can't remember who it was, but kind of quite a prominent art historian who was denied permission to reproduce her images because they disagreed with what she was saying. And I was saying that everything I've published on her work has been vetted by them. Not kind of at the level of kind of editorial control, but they have asked to see what am I going to say. So it's very controlling.
Who will inherit the estate? Did she have any siblings?
She's got a brother, yeah, he's a filmmaker.
Okay.
But it seems quite disconnected. I mean, I haven't seen. Does he figure in that documentary?
Not really.
Yeah.
He's kind of a surprise. Like the one or two times that you do hear about him. Like I think, and not to sound silly, but like her Wikipedia page, I think mentions like in one tiny sentence, like, oh, and she has a brother. Like he's this sort of like footnote.
Perhaps he wrote it.
The like story of the Woodmans.
Can I ask about the photographs specifically? Two things. One is about the shutter release cable problem. So you showed that photograph which had the shutter release cable in it. In fact, there's a great Steichen self-portrait, I think, which has that in, isn't there? It's wonderful.
Oh, is there?
Yeah. But in most of these small, large format camera prints, there's no shutter release cable evident at all. So they were all taken with a timer, presumably, were they?
A lot of them were taken by a friend.
Ah, okay, good. So yeah. So
and a lot of them that I don't know if they're the ones you've got, but a lot of them aren't her either. She had one of her friends looked very like her, and you can't. Not that it matters, but you can't. Some of them you can't tell if it's her or not, and if it was not her in front of the lens, then it was slowing behind, clicking the shutter. So I'm not sure if she used a timer or not.
Which is interesting because it creates this ambiguity around authorship of the photograph or self-representation, which is to do with that question.
Well, I think it was quite deliberate. I think those questions about authorship were quite deliberate in what she was doing.
Because that thing you were saying about and I think you were both making this argument about the self appearing and disappearing, which at one level might be about gendering. So is it a woman or a man, a sort of androgynous body, or is it her, or is it her disappearing or present or absent or authoring or being represented and all that stuff. And I think all that stuff was really good because it challenges a temptation that exists for these photographs because of something that I'm going to call their beauty. Right? Those large format small photographs I find very beautiful. And what's the nature of the beautiful? Is the sort of lyricism of them, meaning something like you feel this kind of trying to speak about the world from some subjective position, right? Some sort of lyricism like that. I'm speaking about how things are, what it is to be embodied, blah blah. And there's that pull of looking at the photographs that way that I don't think necessarily is framed by the suicide, though you could, by analogy, talk about Van Gogh in this way and the sort of intensity with which one could look at those pictures lyrically. And I'm kind of interested in how you do or don't deal with that, because the beautiful quality of them, their sort of song to the self lyrical feel, and the how they are and their sharpness and their deep darks and lights and all that kind of stuff. They're very attractive. They have a great pull to them, I think, as images. And I don't know how we negotiate that in relation to that lyricism.
That makes me think of the scale of her photographs is often referred to as intimate. And I think there's a lot of maybe unconscious gendering that happens in talking about her work in that way. And I think, at least in my opinion, when I oftentimes read people talking about that intimate scale, it feels as if a jump has been made already to sort of reading it through like the domesticity and the femininity depicted. And I think those things are, whether the person realizes it or not, kind of underwritten in their use of the word intimate. And then, of course, beauty brings up a whole can of worms in that vein. So that doesn't directly answer your question, but I do think there's a lot of potentially problematic, and I'm not saying what you just said, but it makes me think of how
you can say it if you
there's a lot
want.
of potentially problematic gendering that happens kind of.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting to say that, because I can, as I said, I can really vividly remember seeing them, and they are incredibly beautiful, not just because, they're beautiful images, but they're beautiful photographs. I remember back in the old photographer's gallery, and they're tiny little things on the wall, and how I regret not buying one of them then when they were almost affordable. But yeah, that is, that is something that's quite... But yeah, even just the kind of intensity of the beauty of the photograph as a thing, let alone kind of what it shows is... And I don't think I had seen, before that point, any photographs that were that beautiful. But it's interesting what you say about the kind of gendering of that intimacy.
And the scale does make you come closer and look closer.
Yeah.
The small scale, I think, amplifies the lyricism or the beauty by really bringing you sort of like nose to glass with the image.
And now, in the world of kind of fine art photography, where you're so used to seeing these great big photographs and digital prints often, where that's become kind of such a kind of format or mode of contemporary art that it's very, very different to that experience of walking around and see it Thomas Struth or or something like that. And so it is an incredible experience, which perhaps to some people would be more familiar. But it's certainly the first time I had been in a gallery space and seen things that looked like that on that tiny scale, and that kind of exquisite detail, where you are looking up. You have to put your nose against the glass to see these things properly, which is obviously very different to these huge scale images that have been shown more recently.
One last point while nobody's sticking their hand up. The intimacy kind of problem. One of the things you said, John, that I thought was, thought-provoking was about these interiors, and obviously other people have spoken about these kind of slightly run-down, ruined house interiors that these earlier photographs are shot in. And if we were to think of them as speaking about the domestic space of woman, they're not the obvious place to do it. I don't know how you think about the fact that they are sort of apparently abandoned houses, empty. They don't seem to have that direct polemic about that in them to me.
Something that I didn't really mention is that, I forget who it was, that there's sort of one of these primary sources that positions themselves, as like a mouthpiece for this now deceased person. One of them talks about how she, or at least one of them talks about how she was drawn to these spaces not just to work in, but also to live in. And I think it was maybe her second year at RISD, she started living and working in like this former dry goods store, like the second floor. It used to be called like Pilgrim's Mill or something. And now actually the first floor is called Mills Tavern, and it's like the most expensive restaurant in the city of Providence. But she inhabited this sort of falling apart space, not just to produce her work in, but you know, in some of the, we didn't show any of these photographs, but you can see in some of the photographs that it is her living space. You see like a bed in the background. And so I'm not so much the abandoned houses where she wasn't also living, but some of these abandoned spaces were not just not studios in like a professional sense, but studios also in like a residential sense. And it makes me think about, I think there are a lot of artists who have kind of collapsed the sort of like living and working space. And again, I don't think I'm necessarily directly answering the question, but for her, I think some of these spaces were somewhat domestic.
Well, I'm just going to like abuse my role at the minute just to jump in with a question. But I wondered about the scale of a lot of the photographs, because I just love that they're Polaroids. That maybe has something to do with the fact that I'm a 90s baby and I was very jealous of my sister's Polaroid camera. But I think that maybe is it this kind of idea of the scale of those Polaroids maybe kind of complicating the idea of the self-portrait. And by that I mean that the fact that they're the small scale Polaroid obviously being quite widely available thing, maybe not as expensive as other types of material, that i.e. kind of a low quality thing, and not high art in any sense, that does that maybe kind of disrupt the idea of the lineage of self-portraiture as like this canvas or sculptural and that kind of thing. But at the same time, the fact that they're so small and they are kind of linked to amateur photography, that they kind of almost invite as well the idea of her being more close to her as a person, and therefore invite a reading as a self-portrait. And I don't know what anybody else thinks about like the size of whether or not that's something that is important in reading whether or not they're self-portraits.
It's really interesting that you draw on the lineage of self-portraiture, because if you think of like Rembrandt, like maybe in some people's opinions like the ultimate self-portraitist, like this made up a word. And his paintings that, not always, but they were so large and kind of in a similar yet opposite way for photographs, like the largeness invites you to come close. But then I think it's really interesting about the small size, distancing her from a lineage of sort of massive self-portraiture in which you maybe sort of immortalize yourself on like a more monumental scale.
No, I'd never thought about that.
Yeah, I'd never thought about it until now. It's a good question, or a good point.
Okay, so it remains for us to thank our speakers again, who did a fantastic work for us. And in the normal run of things, Irina gets to say something now. Are you going to do it?
Guys, thank you very much for coming. We hope you enjoyed our evening, and would also be very, very grateful if you fill out the evaluation forms, the surveys. You'll find them on your table. Thank you very much. We would appreciate that a lot. Thank you.